in Australia, really. I wanted to see Sydney. So there was about 4 or 5 hours. I took a night train. And we talked in our own language, just normal conversation. When suddenly this lady got up and she said, "I wish you people wouldn't jabber like that, but speak the King's English." I was very taken aback and I said, "Madam, I can speak English and another 4 or 5 languages, but I'm afraid if you couldn't speak English, you would have to bark." She just sat down and didn't utter a sound.
1945, and the war gives way to a shaky peace. A place called home is for many only a memory, as they consider their options for an uncertain future. Australia, along with other countries, opens its doors, but on certain conditions. Migrants must be white, healthy, and if non-British and sponsored by the government, prepared to work under contract for 2 years. Between 1946 and 1952, 400,000 people arrive in Australia. Upon arrival, they're transported to one of a number of migrant centres, or they go directly to jobs that they're often ill-prepared for. Nothing in their new land is like the countries they have left. Everything is foreign. The language, the food, the culture, the attitudes, even the work and the weather, and for many, the freedom of post-war Australia. All that remains of their homeland is contained in a suitcase. Sava Spasojevic is from a part of the world in which even today peace is no more than a memory. He arrived in Australia with an international language, music, a language which became the key to many doors closed to other immigrants.
Well, I was born in northeastern part of Yugoslavia, on the northern side of Danube, about 106 kilometers from Belgrade. That's my family was established there for some 350 years. And as a boy of 6, I started piano. I think my mother was very clever in that way. She didn't want to push me into it. She said, "Would you like to learn piano? But don't tell me now," she said. "Think about it overnight and tell me tomorrow. If you say yes, I would expect you to do very well. If you say no, that's all right." And the following day I said yes. And as I started then, I played until the war, came to Yugoslavia. I was having lessons all the time.
So what happened once the war began?
I decided, because it was such a sort of war-like atmosphere in Europe, I thought, well, I would have to go to war anyhow. So it's better to go as a commissioned officer than to go as a private, And I entered the Royal Military College, which I finished in 1940. And after that, I was stationed in Bosnia for a year. Exactly a year later, the war happened. And of course, Yugoslavia was liquidated in a matter of 17 days or something. And eventually, I became a prisoner of war in Germany, where I was pushed and shoved really from camp to camp, because I was in a special penal camp, right? Then when the invasion of Europe started, by the Allies, they shifted us to Eastern Pomerania. We stayed there for some time, and when we could hear the Russian machine guns approaching, they got us up, you see, and we marched from the 28th of January until the 3rd of March in 1945, in that European winter where snow was really knee-deep. Well, so much so that we were not only ourselves, there were the American columns, French columns, all sorts of various people that they eventually got, as prisoners. And you could see people in the ditches lying dead, frozen completely. So that when we arrived near Dutch frontier, out of the number of people that started that march, or 2,000 or something. There were just about 1,100 who arrived there. And when we arrived in Alexisdorf, young and healthy as I was, I had to be led by two people. I couldn't walk by myself. I was so emaciated and so weak. So it was a very, very dreadful experience.
Did you consider going back to Yugoslavia?
No, I was very much determined not to go back home because I just simply couldn't see myself living under a communist regime. And I knew that my family would be very badly treated because they were known anti-communists, which they were, as I learned later on, you see. So I just didn't want to go home. And in that wish, I was confirmed when the first letter arrived from my mother. Allegedly, they had to write to all their relatives abroad, husbands, sons, nephews and whatever, to get them to come back. And all the mail in those days was censored. So she had to appear as a good citizen and yet as a good mother as well, you see. So she wrote the letter to me saying that the life is absolutely wonderful. We never had it better. Everything is just so beautiful and so fine. We even secured a very good job for you with Uncle such and such. Oh, the censor must have thought she's really a patriotic woman, you see. But he didn't know that Uncle was buried 4 years earlier. So actually she told me, don't come back, which I decided not to do before I got that letter, you see. And then for some reason, I could have gone to America, to Canada, to England, name it. It was all possible, But somehow I set my mind to come to Australia. The reason being that Australia was the furthest away from Europe. And there I thought another war between the West and the East could occur very soon too. As a matter of fact, there was some sort of intentions, particularly among the American militaries, to push the Russians back into their pre-war frontiers, But, however, that did not happen. And eventually the Iron Curtain fell. I was very happy to be out of it. I just remained firmly in favor of going to Australia, which we couldn't do in 47 or 46. For some reason or other, the Baltic people were given preference over everybody else. And there were a new wave of refugees immediately after the war, because during the war, as everybody knows, Baltic states, were on the side of Germany fighting the Russians. Right? Now, after the war, the Baltic states were to be annexed to Russia. Of course, all those who were collaborating with Germany were frightened for their lives, and they ran away. Now, among the other refugees and displaced persons, there were people who even recognized some Balts that arrived in Australia as their guardians in various camps. And there were even such who had SS sign, tattooed on their arms. But that was a situation, you see, and once they became refugees, well, all that was forgotten, you see. So I don't say they all were like that. There were some people who really lived normal lives, in Baltic countries during the war, but just didn't want to come under communists, you see, and escaped for their lives. And so the first non-Baltic people, like Poles and Yugoslavs and so forth, started arriving in late 47 and 48, you see. The first few ships, took people from the American zone of Germany, and I was in the British zone of Germany. So the first transport that left there was one in which I came, and that was in 48, towards the end. I think we left Europe sometime in September or something, on a boat which was a German war transport ship called Togo, The day when we sailed into Sydney Harbour was a perfect day. We went under the bridge, and was it by chance, by accident, or by design? I don't know. But I think we were treated as second-class citizens on that occasion when we had to disembark. We did not dock anywhere where there was a passenger disembarkation, you see. They took us right into Darling Harbour. We hopped out of the boat. We had to jump, really, virtually, over beams and girders and all sorts of things that were on the ground to reach the train, which was then in Darling Harbour train line, you know. So we boarded the train there, and so we continued on from Sydney to Bathurst. All right. We arrived in Bathurst sometime early in the morning, you know, and were welcomed there and so forth and so on, and went into that Bathurst Immigration Centre, which was about 9 miles out of Bathurst. And originally, I think it was an army camp, you know, with army huts, wooden army huts, which in some cases were quite all right for single people. But the funny thing was really that if there were families, they got so many beds as they required for the family, and then there was a blanket hanging, you know, to separate them from the next family, you know, who was in the same hut. And so there were very funny stories out of that period, really. However, this very nice man, who I said was artistically inclined, he was the director of that center. His name was Bill Rees, and he made it a rule that whatever transport of migrants arrives, they have to give a concert in a few days' time. So I got all my people that were on the boat with me, you see, and sorted ourselves out and decided on the program and so forth and so on. So the concert was on a Friday night, and all the notables from Bathurst were invited to come. The mayor, the magistrate, the chemist, name it, you know, the doctor, the superintendent of the hospital and so forth. All the, you know, notables. So the concert went off quite well, you know. I played solos and I accompanied the others, and so it was all right. This Latvian girl even performed the dance, you know, and so forth. And the reception was very good indeed. And on Monday, my name was called out over the loudspeakers to report to the director of the center. I thought, what does he want with me now? So I went there, and he said, he was very complimenting me, you know, on the beautiful program, and we never had a concert like that, and so on and so on. And he said, well, look, I would like to make a proposition to you. He said, I would like you to stay here in the center. We'll employ you as a temporary public servant. And he said, I am the director of the center. Jack Cameron is my assistant. And he said, you will be in charge of the holding center. But in addition, he said, I would also like you to be responsible for the cultural life in the center here. So I thought it was really very good. You know, I didn't have anybody in Sydney, didn't know anybody anyhow. So I said, well, that'll be fine. And I don't have to be worried that I'll be sent to a factory or something like that, you see. As a matter of fact, you know, before leaving Germany, I gave a lot of my music away, you know, because I thought if they put me to work in a foundry, somewhere like that, you see, I'll probably never play piano again. Although on the shipping list, I came as a poultry farmer, because that's right. That was one of the 10 occupations, you know, that they were looking for. And I thought, all right, look, I wouldn't like to work in a mine. I would like to sort of work in a field or anything like that. But I can count eggs and maybe hose down the chicken sheds or something like that. And, well, this was a wonderful proposition, of course, so I decided to stay. And I didn't regret it, really. And then, of course, Bill Rees was also very kind, that he said, anybody who is a good artist should stay in the center, and he will make an effort to find a suitable job for them. And so the whole group of people was assembled there, who could eventually be formed into a group that became Immigration Department's, I think, the best PR unit ever, because we visited all the Western towns, performing in concerts excerpts of operas, sometimes the full operatic scenes, because they're also painters and the tailors and all sorts of associated trades needed for something like that. And they could create everything you wanted for the stage. I must say, the 3 years I stayed there, instead of 2, were very, very good. I may have stayed there even longer, maybe, or stayed with the immigration department, but that wasn't possible. See, my wife that I just married then had brought with her from Germany a chronic kidney condition, nephritis, for which, generally there is no cure. I was even offering one of my own kidneys if it could be, helping her in any way, but the doctor's laughed and said, he said, you read about that in Time magazine or something like that. It's done only now in America. Here we can't do it. So that was that. And she needed constant attention of specialists, right? Now I wanted to come to Sydney. They said there are no vacancies in immigration department offices here in Sydney. They could send me to Canberra. I said, Canberra or Bathurst is the same, because there are no specialists in Canberra either in those days. She would have to travel 4 hours by train either way, or half an hour by plane, whatever she chose to do. And I said, look, in that case, I think we'll just leave here and go to Sydney and try to fight our own way through, which we did. And then, she died in 1953. And soon after that, I got in touch with musical people in Sydney here and so forth. And eventually, Clarice Lorenz asked me if I'd be interested to, work with her in what then used to be the New South Wales National Opera. And I started, first of all, really as the booking officer, Not that I did all the bookings, really. There were 2 girls who did that, but I was sort of in charge of them. And eventually I was then promoted up and became company secretary.
What were your first impressions of cultural life in Sydney?
Oh, yes, that was a very great disappointment, really. I was coming in the very early stages upon my arrival in Bathurst. I thought to see that big metropolis, Sydney, and come have a good weekend here and, get as many concerts and recitals and theaters that, I could possibly manage. So I arrived here with very great expectations, as you can imagine, Lo and behold, having arrived on Saturday morning, I got the Sydney Morning Herald opened on the advertisement at the back, for entertainment. And guess what? Nothing. Not a concert, not a recital, not a thing. Only picture shows. There were a few a few dancing places that you could go to. I was glad, I was not interested in that. And there was one advertisement about a live performance at the Royal, the old Royal, and it was called A Ladies' Night in a Turkish Bath. Well, I thought, all right, if that's the only thing to see, let's go and see it. And I must admit, it was very well done. It was a farce, really, but it was so funny. I don't think I ever laughed as much as I laughed that night, really. There were not as great number of concerts as it is nowadays, And the people who came here as refugees from Germany even before the Second World War, say Jewish people who came from Vienna or from Germany in 1938, 37, 39, many of them were in Sydney here. And being music lovers, because if you grow up in Vienna or in Budapest or somewhere like that, you just take that for granted that you go to all the musical performances you could possibly get to. And they really managed to subscribe to Sydney Symphony Orchestra seasons. And I remember quite distinctly, really, that the first few times I went there, during the interval, you come out into that big foyer, the ante-chamber to the town hall. And you hear German, Hungarian, all sorts of things that makes you think that you are somewhere in Vienna or in Budapest, you know.
But how popular were such events with Australians?
What I found is that the Sydney society then was not very homogeneous as it is now, or much more now than then, you see. There was a great division that anything like opera or ballet was considered to be something that belongs really to highbrows, you know, to people with a lot of money. And the ordinary people just wouldn't go to that, you know. For them, here, there, and music hall would be all right, you know, or maybe, you know, going to pictures, you know, that was have a dinner and show and dinner, that was it, that was entertainment. And I thought it was terribly wrong, really, to do it that way. And today, in retrospect, really, I think that the media, particularly the press, had very much to do with it, really, because in those days, you couldn't open a Sunday paper, particularly, without having 3-4 pages of social news and gossip, you see. And if there was a first night at the opera, you would always find, you know, that Dr. and Mrs. So-and-so came and she was dressed in this and she had this jewelry and she had frock flown from Paris and whatever, mink store, mink coat, or depending on the season. Or Sir and Lady such and such have just arrived, and, you know, the pictures and photos and all that sort of stuff. And that created an impression, I think, among the ordinary citizens, you know, that, well, we're not well equipped, you know, in any way to be there, because you have no minks, you have no diamonds, you have no furs or whatever. So we better don't go there, and they kept away. And the funniest thing was when, I think in 1954 or 55, we had a season, and we just got a public relations officer flown from Brisbane to come to join us here. Over there, she was a radio girl. And she had a brilliant idea that on the first night of the season, you know, she would place herself above the foyer and announce over the microphone the arrivals. In the foyer, there was such a big push that the curtain was 15 minutes late. The front of the house people couldn't get people to go into the theater and take their seats. Everybody wanted to be seen and mentioned. It really was terribly funny. And then some people thought, you know, that they had to have certain seats or else, you know. I won't mention any names, but there were people who insisted to sit in the first row of dress circle. If you gave them second or fourth row, oh God, it was a big offense, you know, and so on. So that it really and truly, it was then, I think, and I wouldn't say about all, but majority of people consider an opera or a concert a place to be seen rather than to be there because you love it. The society here was maybe more akin to the American high society, and that is the money society, you know. In England and in old Russia and in Germany, you had titled families, you still have titled families, you know, and that was something that people were aspiring to and looking forward to and so forth and so on. That was that sort of nobility, you know. Here, it is like in America, you know, if you had money, you were somebody in society. If you didn't have money, you could have a star on your forehead, you know, you still were nothing.
Do you still think of yourself as Serbian?
Well, I spent much, much more of my life here than I spent there. So how can that be still something? Of course, the childhood memories, you know, and the family ties and all that keeps you to that. And as I said, you know, you won't find an actor who forgets the stage where he or she appeared performing for the first time, right? And so it is that as a child, you wake up on the world stage in your home environment, and that stage you can never forget. That's the place where you got to know the trees and the birds and the creeks and the grass and all sorts of things. You don't forget it.